The records don't exist. The names were scrubbed. The files were sealed under court order, and those who knew what happened have either disappeared or gone silent forever. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a fracture in the illusion, a crack in the smooth, curated surface of the American dream. The case of the Fallings family was never meant to reach your ears, because it doesn't just question what happened to 12 children. It questions what we call family, what we think of as care, and who we allow to operate behind the veil of benevolence. If you've ever felt that reality is thinner than it looks, that just beneath the polite smiles and white picket fences, something darker breathes, then lean in. This is for you, but once you hear it, you won't come back the same. In the quiet town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, population 2,981, where front porches still creak under rocking chairs and casseroles are still exchanged during flu season, something festered in the shadows. Something cold, something precise. In 1978, Howard and Margaret Fallings moved into a towering Victorian mansion on Elm Street. The locals called it the haunted house on the hill, mostly in jest. But like most jokes in small towns, it was just soft truth. That house had been abandoned for years, shrouded in ivy and silence. But the Fallings changed all that, at least on the surface. Howard was charming, sharply dressed, the kind of man who smiled with his teeth, but not his eyes. Margaret was polished, elegant, and always watching. They restored the mansion room by room, turning it into a thing of envy. People said they were a power couple, but power has many forms. They said the Fallings were generous, pillars of the community. But when you hear that phrase in a story like this, know that it almost always hides something. By 1980, they adopted their first child, a bright-eyed infant named James. The church rejoiced. Neighbors baked pies. Everyone smiled for the photo. But behind closed doors, Margaret wouldn't let anyone touch him, not even the pastor, not even briefly. Her eyes changed when anyone got too close, like a caged animal's. That's when the first fracture appeared. A single moment, easy to overlook. And yet, it was the first drop of blood on what would become a very long trail. Over the next 5 years, they adopted 4 more children: Elizabeth, Thomas, Catherine, and William, all under 6 years old. All acquired with eerie speed. No waiting lists, no delays, no records anyone could check. You see, in most places, adoption is a bureaucratic maze: background checks, home inspections, psychological evaluations. But Howard was wealthy, connected, protected, and when people have power, the rules bend for them like heat-warped glass. You think a background check matters when the man signs checks for the board running it? But here's where the cracks deepen. None of the children attended school. Margaret claimed to homeschool them. They didn't join sports. They weren't in scouts. No playdates. No friends. They existed in the periphery, shadows in the background of church pews, eyes vacant, spines rigid, never speaking unless prompted. One neighbor described them as mirror images. They moved together, sat together, blinked together. Like someone had trained them for uniformity. Or worse, like someone had broken them. By 1987, Thomas, age 9, fell from a tree in the backyard and broke his arm. Margaret, despite being a former pediatric nurse, refused to take him to the hospital. She tried to reset the bone herself. It got infected. He went septic. Only when he was hallucinating from fever did Howard finally drive him to the ER. The doctor who saw Thomas would later say he didn't cry once, not during the setting, the cutting, or the stitching. She said he stared into the light and waited like he wasn't allowed to feel pain. When she asked for his medical records, there were none. The explanation? Lost in a fire. Convenient, but not convincing. She filed a report. Child Protective Services sent a caseworker. He met with the family, saw the children, and filed a glowing review. Clean home, healthy kids, no signs of neglect. What he didn't write was that the children never made eye contact, that they flinched at sudden sounds, that they moved. Only when Margaret did. He didn't write it, because he didn't see it. Or maybe he did and looked away. Between 1988 and 1990, the Fallings adopted 3 more children, Robert, Anne, and Henry. That brought the total to 8. People started whispering. How do you adopt 8 children in 12 years without a single known agency? Why do all the children look so empty? Why do their eyes look like they've seen something they'll never unsee? But no one said anything aloud. Because Howard wrote checks for the mayor's re-election. Because Margaret volunteered at the hospital. Because that house on Elm Street had become a shrine to reputation. And reputation, in a small town, is a fortress. But then came 1992. A new family moved in 3 doors down. The Fletchers. Michael, a journalist. Susan, a social worker. And their teenage daughter Emily. Susan had spent years working with abused and neglected children. She saw it immediately, the stiffness, the silence, the fear. She tried to connect with Margaret, befriend her, infiltrate, and she did. She got invited inside, and what she saw didn't match the smile. Susan noticed a locked door on the 3rd floor. She heard noises behind it, whimpering, rustling, something wet dragging across the floorboards. She asked Margaret about it. Margaret smiled. Storage. But Susan wasn't convinced. She began keeping notes, watching, listening. She wrote things down, dates, patterns, the way the children avoided Margaret's shadow, the way Howard never touched them, the way they never ate unless told. This was more than trauma. This was programming. But what kind of programming? Before we go further, pause, breathe. Because from here, things change. If you're still here, comment below. Eyes forward, silence breaks. Twice. Once for the children, once for yourself. This phrase will lock in the truth. Anchor your awareness. It will mark you as someone who saw what others refused to. Because what happens next was never meant to be revealed. Not in this lifetime. Not without a cost. Ready to continue? Good. Let's go deeper. There are moments in a man's life when the world tilts, not violently, not with fire or noise, but quietly. Like a door you didn't know was there creaking open in the basement of your mind. What Susan Fletcher found next was that door, and what waited behind it was the rot that lies beneath polished floors and lace curtains. She returned to the Fallings' house again, this time alone. Margaret seemed eager, almost too eager, to welcome her in, as if she needed someone to see, not for help, but for validation, for witness. Evil, you see, doesn't always hide in fear. Sometimes it wants to be noticed. Sometimes it waits to be understood. That day, Susan made an excuse. She asked to use the bathroom upstairs. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Upstairs, Susan moved. With the trained eyes of someone who's walked into homes where screens get buried under wallpaper, she scanned the hallway. Pictures of the children, all stiff, all staged, none smiling. A hallway of hollow eyes. She climbed to the 3rd floor. The door at the end was locked, just as before. But this time she listened closely. No crying, no footsteps, just humming. A low, mechanical hum, like something alive, but not human. When she asked Margaret again what was behind the door, her demeanor changed. Not angry, not nervous, just still. Her voice dropped. Those are the quiet ones. That phrase would burn itself into Susan's memory. Because it wasn't just strange, it was coded. As if Margaret had categorized them, grouped them, designed them. Susan left that day with more than suspicion. She left with fear. Real fear, the kind you don't shake off. The kind that crawls up your spine when your instincts scream that you've touched something older than evil. Something designed, a system. And systems don't die easily. She began digging. Not just into the Fallings, but into where the children might have come from. That's when the trail started to go dark. No birth certificates. No adoption agency. Records. No state paperwork. Just names and arrival dates. And one more thing, a pattern. Every one of the Fallings children came into the home either directly after a private hospital closure or a church-run orphanage fire. 12 children, 12 sites. All now erased or mysteriously destroyed. You're starting to see it now. Aren't you? This wasn't random. It was surgical, coordinated, covered. So Susan reached out to her husband Michael, the journalist. He started asking questions. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests. He asked around town. He found people didn't want to talk, and not out of politeness. Out of fear. One pastor who once baptized the Fallings' third child told him, "Some people have a light in their eyes. Margaret, she has a mirror. You see what you want, but there's nothing behind it." Michael found one clue. A name. A woman who claimed to be the former midwife at an orphanage in upstate New York, one of the facilities that burned down just a week before the Fallings adopted their 5th child. Her name was Sister Madeline. She lived in a retirement home. In New Jersey, Michael drove out to meet her. He brought a recorder. He never got to use it. When he arrived, Sister Madeline was gone. Transferred 2 days before. No forwarding address. No discharge paperwork. Just an empty bed and an orderly. Who whispered, "They came at night." Who? Michael asked. The man shook his head. The ones who take names away. What does it mean to take a name away? Not just erasing a file, not just deleting a record, but removing the person, unmaking their existence like pulling a thread from a tapestry. That's what was happening here. These children didn't come from nowhere. They were taken from places designed to make them disappear, to erase their history, to erase who they were, and who profits from that. When Susan began pressing local officials harder, she received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Just 4 words, "You've been warned once." She showed it to the sheriff. He shrugged, said it was probably a prank, told her to let the Fallings be. Michael published a small column in the Millbrook Gazette about the unusual adoption patterns, without names, just patterns. The next day, their car was vandalized, brakes cut, a warning. No police follow-up. This is where most people stop. Where the fear becomes louder than the curiosity. But not Susan, because Susan had seen it before, not this exact shape, but the echo of it. In foster homes where children came back different. In adoption centers that were too well funded. In churches that had locked rooms and no explanations. She believed now that the Fallings weren't acting alone. That they were part of something larger. An order, an agreement, an institutional machine, something old. Something cold. Michael reached out to federal investigators under a pseudonym. He sent them the pattern, the dates, the burned sites, the missing records. They responded, once. "We're looking into it." Then silence, complete. 3 weeks later, Margaret stopped inviting Susan over. The front door stayed locked. Curtains drawn. The children, now 12 in number, were no longer seen in public. But here's the moment, the rupture, the descent. Because Susan found a photograph, not just any photo. An aerial image from 1979, the year the Fallings first moved in. Taken by a historical society drone cataloging architecture. It showed the mansion, before the trees fully grew in, and in the backyard was a structure that doesn't exist anymore, a small building. Stone walls, iron roof, removed, vanished, with no demolition record. She showed the photo to local historians. They had no idea it existed. The property deed didn't list it. Blueprints ignored it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what lay behind the building. A pattern of mounds, 12 of them. Shallow, uniform, like graves. Susan brought the photo to a friend in forensics. The spacing, the depth, the shadow contrast, he agreed. They were burial plots. Or holding cells. He wasn't sure. But one thing he said chilled her to the core. They weren't made recently. These predate the Fallings by decades. So here's the question. Were the Fallings collectors or continuers? What were they really raising in that house? Children? Or something else? In the next section, we descend even further into the original blueprints, into the town's forgotten archives, and into the real reason why the Fallings chose that specific house, on that specific land. Keep going. You've already crossed the threshold. There are places in America where history doesn't just linger, it festers. It lies dormant beneath the foundations, beneath the manicured lawns and smiling realtors, waiting to be reawakened. The house on Elm Street, the Fallings estate, was one of those places. But to understand its purpose and what Susan Fletcher was beginning to uncover, we have to go back further. Not to 1978, when the Fallings arrived, but to 1889, the year the land changed hands for the first time under an unusually restrictive deed clause. Susan, now fully committed to unveiling the truth, went to the Millbrook Municipal Archives. What she found wasn't just disturbing. It was silenced. The mansion had been built on land that once belonged to a Quaker sanitarium, a facility known as the Ashridge Home for Spiritual Correction. On record, it had been a place of healing, a sanctuary for the emotionally distressed. But when Susan found a yellowed handwritten letter tucked inside a weather logbook, the truth seeped through like water under rotted floorboards. The letter was from a nurse named Eleanor Pritchard, dated October 3, 1902. It spoke of children. Dozens who were taken in silence, kept beneath the home to prepare them. The letter wasn't addressed to any authority. It was a confession. In it, Eleanor wrote, "They are not born like us. They are shaped, trained. The order says they must be clean of past and name. They must be vessels, not selves." Vessels. That word echoed like thunder in Susan's ears. The house wasn't random. The land wasn't random. It had been used before, to break children, to erase their identities, to turn them into something obedient, predictable, programmed. But who was behind it? Who had the power to run such an operation in plain sight for over a century? Susan began tracing ownership records. After Ashridge closed in 1923, the property passed through a shell corporation, Chalcombe Holdings, whose ties stretched across states and even into the Vatican archives, based on old tax records. The land was never sold, only transferred. And each transfer followed a predictable pattern. First, a new name, then a new family. Finally, a new set of children. When Susan returned to the archives the next week, that logbook, the one with Eleanor's letter, was gone. The clerk claimed no record of it ever existing. But Susan had already made copies. Michael, her husband, contacted a former intelligence officer turned whistleblower. The man, who spoke on condition of anonymity, reviewed the documents and dropped a single, unforgettable sentence. "What you've found is a breeding ground. Not for children, for assets." Assets. That was the next crack in the illusion. The children weren't adopted. They were acquired, not for love, not for care. For utility. The Fallings weren't parents. They were handlers. Now, let's pause and make something brutally clear. This isn't about some isolated family or one broken home. This is about systems, institutions, the quiet mechanisms by which people, especially children, are molded to serve functions they don't even understand. Because the real power doesn't parade itself. It operates in silence, in shadows, in lineage. You think intelligence agencies don't use psychological training from childhood? You think churches never sanctioned re-education? You think adoption. Systems are free from influence. Think again, and while you're thinking, remember this. The man who taught you to obey was once a boy who wasn't allowed to cry. The woman who raised you with fear in her hands was once a girl whose voice was taken before she knew what it meant. That's how it spreads, generation to generation, not just abuse, but design. The remaking of people into tools, Susan's. Research kept pulling her deeper. She discovered that 3 of the Fallings' adopted children shared rare blood markers, an anomaly seen only in highly selective gene studies run by now-defunct Cold War research programs. When she contacted a retired geneticist from one such program, his response was immediate and chilling. Those markers aren't natural, they're curated. Curated. As in, bred. This wasn't about rescuing orphans. It was about creating programmable humans. Vessels, clean of history. Bound by control. And likely subjected to things darker than neglect, sleep conditioning, language restriction, food deprivation, cold exposure, repetition drills. All of it is documented in MP Ultra, offshoots and black budget operations, masked under names like behavioral remediation or emotional recoding. You don't need wires and helmets to break a mind. You just need repetition, silence, and a child too young to fight back. And the Fallings had 12 of them. Then came the final discovery. The original blueprints. Susan acquired a copy from an out-of-state historical society. They showed something never mentioned in public plans, a sub-basement, accessible only through a hidden passage behind the fireplace. It spanned beneath the entire east wing. Reinforced walls, soundproofing, 12 rooms, each 8 feet by 6 feet. Labeled only by number. She confronted Margaret. Or tried to. But by then, the mansion was empty. No forwarding address. No moving trucks. No goodbye. Just a for sale sign. And silence. The neighbors said they left in the middle of the night. One claimed he saw 4 black vans. Another claimed he heard singing, not joyful, but mechanical, like a chant. What happened to the children? No one knows. The last trace was a grainy security camera clip from a gas station 3 towns over. The children in white coats, lined up silently. Behind Margaret, not one of them making eye contact with the cashier. The footage disappeared from public record 2 days later. Now you tell me, was this about adoption? Or was it a harvest? A harvest of blank minds, blank souls, ready to be filled. And if you think this is over, if you think this was some unique tragedy locked in the past, then you've already lost, because what was done in the Fallings' home is still being done. In other forms. Under other names. Next, we descend into the final level of evidence, whistleblower testimony, classified operations, and the terrifying probability that this wasn't just psychological control, it was spiritual engineering. Stay with me. We've only scratched the surface. By now, you may be tempted to dismiss this story as fringe, some blend of psychological horror and urban myth. But what if I told you that the Fallings case wasn't the end of a thread, but the start of a map connecting institutions you trust to intentions you were never meant to see? The files Susan unearthed next didn't just tie the Fallings estate to historical atrocities. They revealed a blueprint for how to manufacture compliance, not just in children, but in entire populations. One name kept surfacing, Project Seraphim, a supposedly decommissioned post-war behavioral engineering program. Publicly denied, internally classified. Originally funded through a consortium involving defense contractors, private orphanages, and a European eugenics society that rebranded itself after World War II. You've never heard of it, because it never officially existed. But its fingerprint was unmistakable in the architectural designs of the Fallings' home, in the language used in Eleanor Pritchard's letter, and in the eerie sameness of the children who were raised there. Susan's final breakthrough came from a Department of Energy leak an anonymous source who had worked on biometric tracking programs. During the late 1990s, when shown photos of the Fallings children, he confirmed facial pattern consistency consistent with genetic mirroring. In his words, they weren't just chosen, they were duplicated, variants of a single mold. The term he used was singularity line, an internal designation for children bred and raised to reflect near-identical behavioral traits. Calm under duress, high auditory response, minimal empathy, and total ocular fixation during instruction. These weren't simply orphans. They were engineered obedience units, human vessels intended to disappear into institutions, corporations, and perhaps even the military-industrial complex as clean operatives. No birth certificates, no medical records, no origin, but what really sent shivers down Susan's spine was the calendar she found tucked inside a 1981 Fallings family photo album. At first glance, it looked ordinary. But every year, on the same 3 dates, with the same symbols, a black triangle, a white spiral, and a gold circle. Each coincided with strange police reports, missing children, abandoned vehicles, or unexplained power outages in Millbrook and neighboring towns. Always 3 per year. Always matching the calendar. Ritual, not random. Pattern, not coincidence. One of those dates was October 31st. But let's step back for a moment. Why would anyone go to these lengths? Why erase children's pasts, mold their identities, and disappear them into elite systems? Why risk exposure, build hidden basements, erase paper trails? Because memory is the greatest threat to control. Identity, history, lineage. These are the things that make humans unpredictable. And unpredictability terrifies the powerful. A child with no past is a slate. And a slate can be written on, wiped clean, and written on again. And if you can do it to one, you can do it to millions. Look at the education system. How many children are medicated into silence? Look at the foster care industry. How many vanish without real investigation? Look at corporate training, religious indoctrination, even influencer culture. It's not about raising thinkers. It's about designing followers. The Fallings estate wasn't an aberration. It was a testing ground. And this brings us to the most damning revelation of all. Susan received a package in the mail one morning. No return address. Inside was a single flash drive, no note. When opened, it played only one video, grainy footage from inside the Fallings' hidden basement. A child, perhaps 6 or 7, standing alone in a cement room. No furniture, just a speaker in the corner. A voice repeated 3 phrases over and over. You are not your name. You are not your past. You are your function. The child stood still, motionless, UNBLINKING. At the bottom corner of the screen, a timestamp, August 12, 2004. That child would be a young adult today. One of us working a job, smiling at coworkers, remembering nothing. The only way this ends is if we stop pretending it didn't begin. The Fallings weren't anomalies. They were prototypes, proof of concept. And behind them are thousands more. Children not just hidden, but redefined. We're not just talking about erasing documents. We're talking about erasing souls. And if you think this is too dark to be true, ask yourself, what kind of world would benefit from perfectly programmable people? One that already exists, now. We go deeper into names, documents, and the surviving child who escaped the house in 1992. Because this rabbit hole doesn't just end in the past. It ends in you. And what you were never told about your own conditioning. His name was Daniel. Or at least that's what the world came to know him as. But when Susan finally found him in a rural rehabilitation center tucked deep into Montana's wilderness, he introduced himself with a code. Subject 6B, line 2. No last name. No origin story, just a label, a designation. like an inventory item returned to storage after a failed deployment. Daniel had escaped the Fallings house in 1992, the same night a fire broke out in the northern wing of the estate. Local reports described the blaze as accidental, but Daniel told Susan it was lit on purpose, not to escape, but to cleanse. He was the only one who survived. Or so he believed. Daniel's body bore silent testimony. Faint barcodes tattooed under his ribcage, surgical scars behind both ears, and what he called the listening coil implanted beneath his scalp, which he claimed still emitted pressure during electrical storms. But more unsettling than the physical remnants was the behavioral conditioning he couldn't unlearn. He spoke in measured, emotionless sentences. He couldn't make eye contact for more than 3 seconds. And when he heard certain frequencies, particularly low, sustained tones, he froze, unable to move, his eyes darting for unseen observers. Susan recorded over 22 hours of interviews with Daniel before his caretakers abruptly revoked access, citing mental deterioration. But in those conversations, he mapped out the Fallings home in eerie detail, rooms that didn't exist on blueprints, elevators that moved without buttons, and evaluation chambers where they were taught to recite tasks under duress. He remembered one room in particular, Room Omega, completely soundproofed, always dimly lit, and lined with two-way mirrors. Daniel claimed this was where the guests would come. Men and women in black uniforms, faces covered, always carrying clipboards. They never spoke to the children, only observed them, sometimes for hours. He remembered another child, a girl with platinum hair who never spoke, but could draw perfect blueprints of every room after only seeing them once. She disappeared. In 1991, taken away by one of the guests after passing something called the final calibration. Daniel never saw her again. But years later, during a late-night television segment, he recognized her face in the background of a defense contractor commercial. Same eyes, same posture, same fixed, emotionless stare. And this is where Susan's investigation took a dangerous turn. After publishing a blog post titled The Lost Lineage, Fallings Child Speaks, her site was hacked, her files wiped, and she began receiving anonymous phone calls, always silent. Just breathing. Once, a voice whispered, "You're not authorized to access that memory." She went dark for 6 months, but before she disappeared from the digital world, she sent one final email to her encrypted network of researchers. It contained a scanned page from a declassified 1984 training manual used by Harrogate Systems, a private psychological research firm contracted by several government branches. On that page was a diagram, a flowchart of child development. Stages from acquisition to neutralization, with one branch labeled in red ink, Societal Integration, Operative Level C. Beneath that, one chilling note: if behavioral collapse occurs, initiate memory reset, relocate, reassign, reintroduce. The implication was staggering. These children weren't just being raised to serve in covert roles. They were being strategically placed into civilian life. Your coworker, your therapist, your neighbor, all with implanted scripts, altered memories, and if necessary, shutdown codes. Susan's final message ended with a question. If memory defines identity, what happens when identity is synthetic? Daniel's existence raised deeper questions, not just about the Fallings, but about the institutional willpower that made such a family possible. Who protected them? Who funded them? And most chillingly, who still runs the program today? You might be thinking, surely this level of psychological warfare would require too many people, too much oversight, too much risk. But the most efficient systems of control don't need mass complicity. They just need belief. And when you believe a lie long enough, it becomes indistinguishable from reality. The children of the Fallings house weren't born broken. They were made that way, and the machine that made them? It never stopped. It began with a single line item buried in a 1989 federal budget proposal. Unremarkable at first glance. Behavioral Systems Development, $4.2 million. No agency listed. No description attached. But when cross-referenced with archived procurement reports, one startling name emerged repeatedly as a recipient: Harrogate Systems, Inc., the same contractor referenced in Susan's final email. That company was dissolved in 1995. But only on paper. Through shell entities and offshore restructurings, it re-emerged under multiple pseudonyms: Lunark Analytics, EchoStrata Research, and most recently, CON, short for Child Optimization Network, leaked internal documents from a whistleblower. Only known as CILO revealed that CON operated under a triadic system, something Susan and her team began to call the three-phase indoctrination cycle. The structure was both terrifying and genius. Phase 1, fragmentation. Phase 2, submission. Phase 3, simulation. Each child brought into the network would undergo these stages, tailored uniquely to their neurological vulnerabilities. Phase 1, fragmentation, was pure psychological warfare. Deprivation of sleep, altered sensory input, emotional chaos. Children were stripped of their baseline reality through controlled trauma. They were encouraged to form dissociative identities as coping mechanisms. These fractured selves would later serve as compartmentalized agents, able to switch roles under pre-programmed conditions. Daniel once described it as watching myself act while I hid inside a locked room in my own head. Phase 2. Submission used reward systems, mirror neurons, and synthetic attachments to bond children to fabricated parental figures, often the Fallings themselves. Each child was paired with a handler, referred to as the mirror. The mirror's role was to create dependency, praise obedience, and crush resistance. Children were taught that pain was the price of disobedience, and love the reward of conformity. But the love wasn't real. It was algorithmic, scripted, conditioned, and always withheld just enough to keep the child addicted to its promise. Phase 3. Simulation was the most dangerous. It didn't just train children, it reprogrammed them. With altered memories implanted via immersive VR, hypnosis, and neurochemical induction, children were taught to believe they had normal lives. Entire false childhoods were engineered and embedded. Family photos, report cards, injuries, even fabricated traumas were all inserted into their minds. The goal? To create fully integrated synthetic civilians who would never question their identity until triggered. In the leaked documents, one terrifying phrase appeared again and again: reintegration units, field ready before puberty. This meant these optimized children were being released into society before they even reached adolescence, placed in foster systems, elite schools, or adopted by politically connected families. Many never knew who they truly were. Some still don't. Susan's team attempted to trace the funding back further, but 2 full pages of the 1991 U.S. federal budget were found completely redacted, the only clue being a handwritten note on a recovered interagency memo that read, "Conline 27 disavowable if compromised. Deny, denounce, delete." And then something unexpected surfaced. A researcher named Malik B., who'd worked briefly with Susan before she vanished, discovered a recurring financial anomaly. Every fiscal year, exactly $7.4 million was transferred from a Department of Education discretionary fund to an entity labeled only as Ashridge. Further digging revealed Ashridge to be a private campus located in upstate New York, reportedly shut down in 1978, but satellite images showed active heat signatures as recently as 2023. When Malik attempted to visit the site, he was intercepted 3 miles from the perimeter by unmarked vehicles. Drones appeared. His footage went dark. Days later, he reappeared online, but something was different. His voice was slower. his gaze vacant. And in one livestream, he accidentally exposed a faint scar running behind his left ear, the same placement Daniel once described for his listening coil. He ended his final video with one cryptic sentence: "I was never lost. I was reassigned." The implication was chilling. The program didn't just erase people. It could recapture and reassign them at will. This wasn't about adoption gone. Wrong. This was systemic psychological weaponization disguised as a family, funded by a shadow network and sustained by a public too afraid or too distracted to ask questions. You may never find a photo of the Fallings in any official database, but their legacy? It may be sitting across from you at dinner or staring back in the mirror. It started in 2011, quietly, almost unnoticeably, when a pediatric psychologist in Oregon received a handwritten letter, no return address. The envelope was aged, cream-colored, sealed in wax with the letter F pressed deep into the red resin. Inside was a single page, written in flawless penmanship, the ink slightly smudged in places, as though penned by an unsteady hand. It began simply: "I was number 8. I remember the tunnels. I remember the masks. I remember what they made us do." The psychologist, Dr. Melina Krauss, initially dismissed it as the ramblings of a disturbed mind. But 2 months later, a colleague in Vermont received a nearly identical letter. This one began: "They called me 6. My name isn't real. The games weren't games. If they find me, I disappear again." Over the next 2 years, 10 more letters were reported, all by therapists, child development specialists, trauma counselors, spread across the United States and parts of Canada. Each note claimed to be from a different one of the 12. The mysterious group of children once adopted by the Fallings. The senders never gave their current names, only numbers, only fragments of memories. And always a warning: you are not safe if you know. They never stopped. The program is still alive. Several of the psychologists who received these letters attempted to report them to law enforcement. But each time, something strange happened. Either the letters went missing from evidence lockers, or agents arrived requesting the material before any formal case was opened. One therapist, who tried to go public with her story in a podcast, was later found dead in her home from what police called a self-inflicted overdose. Her family swears she never used any medication. The letters revealed unsettling patterns. Identical phrases, repeated like mantras across multiple states and years. "The mirror never blinks. We spoke in color, not words. They fed us fiction until we forgot the truth. Ashridge was real. My nightmares still smell like chlorine." But the most disturbing part wasn't what the letters said. It was what they predicted. One letter, marked from number 4, warned of a reset event scheduled for 2025. It read, "On solstice night, they restart the cycle, new 12. New Fallings, same ritual." That date, June 21, 2025, had been circled in red ink. No further explanation was offered. Journalist Henry Dahl, who began investigating the phenomena after losing his niece in a closed adoption with connections to an agency once linked to Harrogate, published a series of Substack articles connecting these letters to known MK-style psychological conditioning programs. He claimed that children were never meant to be found, but were engineered to eventually reinsert themselves into society and warn the next generation of threats. He called them the seeded 12, a term that frightened even hardened researchers. The letters weren't just confessions. They were triggers. Dr. Krauss, the first recipient, revealed in an interview before her sudden disappearance that she had started seeing symbols from the letters, triangles inside circles, black suns, and pairs of eyes appearing in the drawings of her young patients. Some of these children had no known relation to the Fallings, yet drew recurring scenes described by the letter writers: a room with no corners, a voice from the wall, and white lights that erased days. It was as if something buried was beginning To wake up again, not in one place but across the country. Simultaneously. And then came the most cryptic letter of all, unmarked. Unsigned, postmarked from nowhere. It contained only a single line. There were never just 12. That revelation changed everything. What if the Fallings weren't unique? What if they were one node in a global network of experimental psychological family units, each designed to raise, fracture, and release optimized human assets? What if these children, the seeded, were growing up among us? What if some have already been activated? And what if others are waiting for their signal? The next section will unveil the audio files leaked from a disbanded experimental psychology lab in New Mexico. Recordings that may contain the actual voices of the mirrors speaking to their child subjects. Voices that once heard are never forgotten. The leak was subtle. A folder named Observations_AW99 appeared on an encrypted server frequented by fringe academics and anonymous whistleblowers. At first, no one took it seriously. But inside were over 700 hours of audio recordings, file after file labeled with cryptic titles like Mirror Protocol Session 17, Language Bleed Trial 4, and Subject Delta Loop Reset. The voice at the beginning of each file was always the same, female, calm, robotic. She introduced herself as Mother. Researchers who downloaded the files reported immediate unease. Not because of the content, though that alone was harrowing, but because many claimed the files played even when their speakers were off. Some said they'd hear faint whispers in the early hours of the morning, always echoing phrases from the recordings. Do not blink, do not speak, do not remember. In Session 17, a child's voice no older than 8 repeats a series of phrases while Mother encourages from the background, Child, my name is not mine. Mother. Good. Child, the room is not a room. Mother. Very good. Child, the pain is not real. Mother, it never was. In another file, a boy sobs uncontrollably while being made to recount the day he was removed from his birth parents. But when he begins to describe the shadow people who greeted him at the orphanage, the tape distorts, audio warps. A frequency spike hits 24,000 hertz, nearly enough to fry most audio systems. The boy's last words before the file cuts out? They blink without eyes. Former NSA audio analyst Craig Embry reviewed the files for a private watchdog group. He described the vocal inflections of Mother as non-human but not synthetic, something in between. He ran voice matching software against known AI databases and public voice banks. Nothing matched. However, a hidden spectrogram layer embedded in the waveform of one file formed the image of a house with no windows, and beneath it, a single word, Ashridge. Then came a video file, just one, grainy, timestamped March 13, 1997. It showed a concrete room, 4 children seated in a semicircle, blindfolded. A red light blinked on above them, and a voice asked, "What do you see now?" Each child responded identically, in perfect synchronization. The woman with the hollow face. The forest with no trees. The door that eats light. The file abruptly ends with the camera jerking toward the ceiling. Just before the feed cuts, a figure enters the room. Black suit, featureless face, holding what appears to be a mirror. Several amateur archivists who listened to more than a few hours of the material began to exhibit symptoms of disassociation, memory loss, and in rare cases, identity bleeding, where they reported confusing their own memories with those described by the children in the tapes. One archivist was found dead beside his laptop, which had been playing a looped clip of a child whispering, "You are me, you were always me." That's when the second phase began. Around mid-2024, emails started arriving at private inboxes of individuals who had downloaded the archive. The messages simply read, "Do you remember what you heard?" If no reply was sent, a second email followed 13 days later. then why are you dreaming about it? The IPs were traced to a dormant server in Ashford County, Louisiana, now widely believed to be the Fallings' original compound. When private investigators attempted to trace the property, they discovered that land records for that section of Ashford had been scrubbed after 1981, and that all satellite images of the area had been replaced with identical tree patterns, copy-pasted to conceal whatever structure remains there. But one drone photographer bypassed the tampered GPS grid. The footage he uploaded to a Darknet forum showed something chilling: a crumbling estate with 12 stone markers in a ring, each engraved not with names but with numbers. Inside the structure was a single metal chair bolted to the floor. Beside it, a mirror, shattered, but still standing upright, and scratched into the wall behind it, faint but visible, the same phrase from the recordings: "Do not remember." The files, though officially discredited and removed from most platforms, continue to resurface. They travel on USB drives at underground hacker conferences, among cult programmers, and whispered about by retired intelligence agents who claimed the project wasn't about controlling children. It was about creating mirrors that reflect what we refuse to see. The next section reveals the buried testimonies of foster parents who raised programmed children without knowing, and how their lives unraveled in terrifying synchronicity once the children turned 12. The testimonies came slowly, many buried in old social services archives, others never officially recorded, passed instead through anonymous letters, cryptic voicemails, or desperate forum posts that were quickly deleted. But pieced together, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Foster families across 3 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, and parts of Alabama, had all at one point adopted children who were later revealed to be part of the Fallings' intake system. These children had no birth certificates, no previous medical records, and in nearly every case, identical scars behind the left ear. The first public testimony came from Marion Bell, a retired nurse who fostered a girl named Elsie in 1994. In a sworn affidavit later suppressed in court, Marion claimed that the child arrived with a pre-recorded cassette tape, which she was instructed to play each night at exactly 9:17 p.m. If the tape didn't play, she wrote, Elsie would wake up screaming in a voice that wasn't hers. A voice too old, too male. On the 10th day, Marion's dog, a German Shepherd, was found mutilated in the backyard. No blood, no prints, just clean surgical removal of all vocal cords. Elsie stared at the scene and said calmly, "He wasn't supposed to bark." In a separate case from 1998, the Farnsworth family took in twin boys named Luke and Elijah. The caseworker said they'd been separated from a religious collective after an alleged fire. For the first year, the twins were normal, quiet, studious, unnervingly obedient. But the moment they turned 12, the family began experiencing time gaps. Clocks would reset. Appliances would turn on in the middle of the night. The twins began drawing strange diagrams on the walls, circuits, doors, geometries not recognized by any earthly architecture. One night, the family awoke to find both boys standing at the foot of their bed, perfectly still, each holding a shard of a broken bathroom mirror. When asked what they were doing, both boys said in unison, "We are collecting reflections. Yours is last." The Farnsworths moved the boys to a psychiatric facility 3 days later. But according to hospital records, the twins vanished during a scheduled MRI scan. No footage, no exit logs. The only clue left behind was a burned segment of the imaging screen which had captured a brief, frame-skipping image of what the technician described as something standing behind the boys with too many arms and no mouth. Other foster parents shared similar horrors: children who never blinked, who whispered Latin in their sleep, who spoke to the same imaginary woman named Mother. Some claimed their foster children predicted accidents before they occurred. One couple's adopted daughter stood in the hallway one morning and calmly stated, "You'll never see your mother again." Hours later, the husband's mother was found dead in her home 2 states away, clutching a photograph of the girl. She'd never met Dot in every instance. Once the children turned 12, they left, not ran away, not abducted. They simply disappeared, often in full daylight, often in front of witnesses. One father, now institutionalized, testified that his son walked backward into a hallway mirror and never came out the other side. Another woman swore she saw her daughter dissolve into static right in front of the kitchen refrigerator, like a TV losing signal, she said. But screaming. Most foster parents who reported these phenomena were later found to have committed suicide, gone missing, or had their statements sealed under federal non-disclosure orders. One rare leak came from Dr. Stephen Krantz, a state psychiatrist who specialized in treating trauma-exposed foster youth. In a leaked consultation memo, he wrote, "They aren't dissociating. They're returning. Their personalities aren't fractured, they're layered. These aren't children in the traditional sense. They're shells waiting for triggers." His license was revoked weeks later, and all his files on the falling subjects were seized under something labeled Directive 113-VRI, classification that doesn't officially exist in any public-facing U.S. database, but perhaps the most disturbing account came from a former caseworker who anonymously uploaded a recorded conversation between her and one of the Fallings children. Now 13, the boy asked her, "Do you know what it feels like to be built?" When she didn't answer, he continued, "To be made out of dead people's regrets? To wake up with other people's voices in your head?" Then he looked directly into the camera, his pupils dilating unnaturally. They think they're raising children, but they're raising echoes of something older and hungry. This pattern, across unrelated families in different states, spanning decades, points to something far deeper than a cult or child trafficking ring. These were not victims. These were not orphans. These were constructs implants placed like time bombs inside the fabric of society. Their purpose, still unclear. Their origin? The Ashridge Mirror Facility, mentioned again and again, though no one has ever found definitive proof it exists. But the next revelation changes everything. A private contractor's internal logbook from 1983, coded and buried beneath layers of CIA redactions, confirms the use of these children in a series of psychological experiments codenamed Project Hollow Seed. It took nearly 3 decades and dozens of vanished records to uncover the final thread. But the evidence was always there, hidden behind shell companies, repurposed medical grants, and silent death certificates. The final revelation doesn't just tie the Fallings enigma to one obscure government experiment. It redefines the very nature of what these children were. They weren't trafficked. They weren't stolen. They weren't even born. According to a redacted memo discovered in the personal archives of whistleblower Dr. Leonard Wick, a now-dead neuroarchitect for the U.S. Department of Advanced Behavioral Science, the children were part of a classified biosynthetic consciousness program. The memo, labeled HSO7, Organic Intelligence Proxies, confirms the unthinkable: subjects generated from harvested memory fields of the deceased. Cores built from neural decay, extracted from morgue-fresh bodies. Language encoded. Identity optional. The Fallings weren't a family. They were a delivery system, a handler group assigned to embed vessels across the American heartland under the guise of adoption. The Ashridge Mirror Facility, now believed to have operated under the name Grafton Behavioral Innovations, specialized in mirror field neural transfer, fringe tech theory in which consciousness could be replicated through light-bending reflective feedback. In simpler terms, memories of the dead could be reconstructed, reseeded, and reanimated inside biological blanks. The children were those blanks, buried in 1991 litigation filings against Grafton, a case that never went to trial. There exists a single half-burnt document marked "Do Not Replicate," It contains side-by-side diagrams, one of a traditional infant brain scan and one of a Fallings child. The latter shows growth patterns not found in any known mammalian species, extra lobes, mirror neuron overgrowth, and a secondary larynx that may account for the multiple voices some witnesses claim to hear. One annotation reads, "Prototype. Echo 12 has achieved full sentience and pre-recognition. Terminate at 11.5 years, but they didn't terminate them. Not all of them. Some were adopted out. Some ran. Some evolved. In a final act of hubris, the Fallings allegedly tried to embed the last Bacco series, 20 into high-ranking political families under a diplomatic child welfare program called Golden Roots. These children would be indistinguishable from real orphans, but each carried a dormant trigger, a sound frequency, a phrase, or even a mirror that would awaken their embedded programming. A memo from 2003 warned, if activated, subjects may not recognize host reality. Outcome: recursive event. What's a recursive event? In system logic, it's a loop in action that calls itself endlessly, unraveling the code it runs on. In human terms, it's a collapse of the memory grid, a deletion of identity itself. And if these children were spread across states, growing into adulthood, some unactivated, some already triggered, that collapse might not be contained. A final note from Dr. Wick's diary, written in shaky pen: the children were built to carry something through us. Not to learn, not to heal, but to pass a message. A contagion made of meaning. A ghost made of thought. They are not possessed, they are possession. Which leaves us with the chilling question no government agency has ever answered. Where are the remaining 12 Echo children now? Because if even one survived into adulthood, unmonitored, with fully activated consciousness, then the Fallings didn't fail, they succeeded beyond control. And if you've ever met someone with no past, no paperwork, eyes that feel just a little too still, who's never spoken of their childhood, never looked in a mirror for more than a second, ask yourself, were they raised or were they planted? This is the end of the Fallings enigma. Or perhaps the beginning of something else. Would you like a cinematic closing line or call to action to end the video with?